Good evening, everyone. My name is John Highbush. I have the honor of being the executive director of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute, and I just want to thank each and every one of you for coming out this evening. In honor of our men and women in uniform who protect our freedoms around the world, if you would please stand and join me for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, in liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Please be seated. Before we begin, I'd like to welcome some special guests we have with us tonight, and I want to start with Mark's family, who he talks about sometimes. First, we'll begin with his great wife, Julie. Julie, thank you. Please stand. We also have with us Mark's daughter, Lauren, and her husband, Nick, along with their beautiful daughter, Simone. Say hi to Simone. Mark's son, Chase, with his lovely girlfriend, Stephanie. Chase, Stephanie. We have with us a fellow by the name of Tommy Huang tonight. Tommy is, when you have your wine this evening at your table under the wings of Air Force One, you can thank Tommy for the great wine. And you might have recognized him as you came through. I sure did, but his name is Pat Boone, and it's great to have you here, Pat. I don't know if you all know, but Pat has a book out, and we hope to have him here in the next few months, so he might be able to sign it for you. So thanks for coming, Pat. I don't know if you can feel it like I can today, but let me just say there are two very special days that come around just about every year here at the Reagan Libraries. And they're days when there's electricity and excitement in the air. It's just vivid enough that you can just about feel it. One of those days is President Reagan's birthday, and we celebrate that every year on February 6th. The Marine Corps band comes, we salute our armed forces, jets fly over, and we pay tribute at the time to one of the greatest presidents in the history of the United States. It's a really patriotic ceremony, and thousands of people come, and there's nothing like it. Maybe nothing like it except for another special day. Now, it may not happen each and every year, but it almost does. And when it comes, it darn near brings the Reagan Library in the beautiful town of Simi Valley to a halt. It's when we are fortunate enough to get Denali, the great one, get him out of his famous bunker in Northern Virginia and onto these hallowed grounds. It's a big deal, as you can see. Many of you probably had to park all the way down Presidential Drive and take a shuttle bus to get up here. That's okay. I promise you it's going to be worth it. And many of you had to be listening very carefully on the day that tickets for this event went on sale, and I know that. Because there are thousands, and I mean thousands, of Mark Levin fans who couldn't be with us tonight in the hall because they just wouldn't fit. Mark's event always sells out in about 10 minutes, and he holds the record. It's a marvelous thing to see. So yes, it's a big day here. It's so big that we really ought to call it Mark Levin Day. In fact, I think we will. Mark, welcome to Mark Levin Day. Well, now that we've dispensed with the formalities and the proclamations, let me add a personal note about Mark's visit today before he sits with me for an interview. I know I could go on and on about how all of Mark's books, including his newest, Rediscovering America, have been #1 New York Times bestsellers. I could sing his praises and congratulate him on a wonderful year in which he's introduced us to some remarkable Levin TV. And I could, as I should, thank him for his service, just as we thank our courageous servicemen and women in the military for his 8 years of work for Ronald Reagan as the great Attorney General Ed Meese's chief of staff, and as Mark's work in the Reagan campaigns of 1976 and 1980. But closer to home and personal to me, I just want to say thanks to Mark for being such a great friend. And he has been a great friend to me, as well as the Reagan Foundation and Library. Many in the audience that I've had the chance to talk with have said how much they've enjoyed the back and forth that Mark has oftentimes afforded me on his radio show as the executive director of the Reagan Foundation. And I want you to know that Mark's not giving me the airtime because I am anything special to his audience. I'm not. Rather, Mark determined that this special place, the home and final resting place of President and Mrs. Reagan, deserves to be honored and supported as the great institution for the conservative cause that it is. And we will always be thankful for that attention, Mark. Thank you. A final note, if I may. By now, I know that most, if not all of you, were kind enough, indeed smart enough, to buy a copy of Mark's book today. And I know it was important to Mark that every single one of you be given the chance to have your book signed and for him to say hello to you while he's here. He goes out of his way, in fact, back and forth across the United States to do this. And I know it's because he loves and admires all of you. But I want you to know that between now and the end of dinner, which we will celebrate with Mark under the wings of Air Force One about an hour from now, you'll have the chance to buy another. You should. I say that because I know that Mark is often asked, what is it that average folks like us, like me and you, can do to support the cause of liberty and freedom that he so eloquently espouses? We're just one person, each of us. After all, what is it we can do to prevent our country from falling into the hands of tyranny and robbing our kids and their kids of the freedom we've so enjoyed? I thought about it, and I honestly think there's no better way than to spread the word, and by that I mean ensure that Mark's book gets into the hands of each and every friend and neighbor or relative that you might have so that they too can arm themselves intellectually on the cause of liberty and participate to the fullest in this incredible experiment that we call America. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, would you please join me in welcoming to the Reagan Library the incredible and honorable, the great one, the Mark Levin.
See the Baldwin's here too. Adam Baldwin and his wife.
Mark, great to have you here.
Can I just say this? This is such an inspiring, magnificent library that you've run here. If you haven't taken the time to go through this library, you really need to take the time to do it, and it'll take more than one day. And it's very, very important that we remember Ronald Reagan, who was not only the greatest president in our lifetime, but he defeated the Soviet Union. He brought America back on a track of prosperity. We think today about the problems we have, and we have a lot of problems, but we had a lot of problems then too. And what President Reagan showed is we can work our way out of these things. If we believe in the country, we believe in God, we believe in family, and we believe in ourselves. The forces arrayed against us today were arrayed against us before. We can learn from him. And it never stops annoying me when I hear Republicans and conservatives say, forget about Reagan, this is a new era. You ever heard the Democrats say, forget about FDR, it's a new era? Two massive landslides like we've never seen in modern American history. Massive electoral vote landslides, massive popular vote landslides. And he was a rock-ribbed conservative. And he stood by his principles like no conservative or so-called conservative before and since. This is a magnificent library you have here. I've been through it many times. If you have children and grandchildren, you really need to bring them through here. We have to teach our kids and our grandkids and remind ourselves outside of the media, outside of the public school system, outside of academia generally, and there's tens of millions of us, and we're quite capable of learning about this country without the left. And I want to say something else about this man. John's one of my best friends. You will not meet a more decent, caring human being in your life. And he has had his personal struggles, and he shows up for work, and he gets behind this institution, and he smiles, and he gives me an overly generous introduction, and it is I who should be praising him. So let's give him an applause. Now, let's bash some liberals. Go ahead.
All right, well, before we do, Mark, I want to say you just look terrific. I mean that, and it's great to see you. I know you've got some back troubles right now, but here with your family and your grandkids and Julie, and it just seems like between your work and the family, things have really come together well. Are you feeling that way? Because it seems like it's one of the best times of your life.
It is. But I just want everybody to know that everything I do is thanks to my parents, my mother and my father. That's... But thank you.
Mark, I get the sense that if someone had the opportunity to read just one of your many books, that you might tell them that Rediscovering America would be the one that they should read. Is that true? And if so, why?
I'd tell them to read them all. I think this book now, in the subtitle, Rediscovering Americanism and the Tyranny of Progressivism, is crucially important right now. So you understand what's going on in this country from an academic, principled, philosophical point of view. Now you might say, well, that's all well and good. No, it's very important because, as I've said on the radio and on Levin TV, you leave the battlefield of ideas to the intellectuals and the academics, you're going to lose your country. And they drive the ideas. They drive the ideas. You can see how the country lurches depending on what the media say, how the country lurches depending on what the Hey, Bobby, how you doing? Depending on how depending on what the Democrats say and so forth. So it's very important that we be able to go toe-to-toe with these people, and we understand the context in which these things are raised. whether it's statues, whether it is the border, whether it is, whatever it is. Because there's really two forces in this country. I don't mean to jump ahead, but there's two forces in this country, with some offshoots, but let's just stick with the two forces. One is an embrace of Americanism. And we can discuss what Americanism is. And the other is an embrace of progressivism. One is a philosophy that is tied to humanity, the laws of nature, to divine providence, to what is said in the Declaration of Independence, unalienable rights for every human individual. Another is about centralized autocracy and the imposition of the will of a relative handful of masterminds on the rest of the people, dressed up as popular sovereignty, dressed up as the best interests of the people or the general welfare of the people. And it's these opposing views that are taking place in our country today. So to understand them beyond a surface level, so we can really compete in the debates and compete in the arguments, compete and engage, I wrote this book. And you can see as events take place, this event, that event, another event, you can see the context typically and almost always applies to these two forces. The original book I wrote, Liberty and Tyranny, pretty much. So, and we have a magnificent history. If you listen to the media today, you'd think we have a lousy history. If you graduate from an Ivy League school, you'd think we have a lousy history. If you graduate from most high schools, you'd think we have a lousy history. This is a magnificent country, and the progressives focus on the imperfections. Every country's imperfect, every institution's imperfect, every human being's imperfect. But we're more perfect than most, and we are definitely a great country. And that's why people risk their lives to come here, and nobody risks their life to leave here, despite all that they say about us and our history.
You know, Mark, you've been doing this for years, a radio show, writing books, now Levin TV. And you have millions of followers. You know, you're right there with Rush and Sean in terms of conservative commentators that people talk about. But something's happened. I'm not sure how I put my finger on it in the last year or two. What you are talking about and the conversations that you're driving are now actually being spoken about, like on the Senate floor and from the Oval Office. You are, as an individual, and what you choose to talk about, it's really making a difference in this country. It's part of the national dialogue, and I wonder if you sense the same thing. Are things a little different for you now that you've expanded into television and the rest of that?
Sometimes I wonder about what you're saying. It's hard for me to know the effect anything has out in the public and so forth. I'm a constitutional conservative. That's what I am. I believe in individualism. I believe in ordered liberty. I believe in republicanism, small r, not democracy, mobocracy, and not centralized autocracy. And sometimes I feel like my views, perhaps your views, are in the minority. I see what's going on in the country with the Republican Party and the constant embrace of some aspect of progressivism. And those senators and congressmen have the guts to stand up and say, no, that's not what we ran on, that's not what we stand for, who are trashed and beaten down and so forth. There's also another movement afoot called nationalism populism. This movement, nationalism populism, has been afoot different times in our history, including the late 1800s, was actually the precursor to progressivism. You know, there was a party in the 1880s called the Populist Party. Populism is more about small d democracy than it is about small r republicanism. And even though some people may mean well in that regard, I would say this to you. Go back to your Declaration of Independence. Those are unalienable rights. They're not up for a vote. I don't care if your neighbors think you should lose your rights. I don't care if the vast majority of the American people vote that way or would vote that way. These are unalienable rights. Your Constitution is the governing manifestation of the Declaration of Independence. Nationalism? No. Americanism. There's a difference. You look at your Constitution. It's not about nationalism. It's got federalism. It's got the 10th Amendment. It's got separation of powers. Not a damn thing about nationalism in there. Because your founding fathers and your framers feared two things: centralized government and the mob. Centralized government and the mob. Only one body was directly elected by the people, the House of Representatives. The Senate was selected by the state legislatures. The president was selected through the Electoral College. All of them have been, despite all the griping today. And judges were appointed for life. Now, of course, I propose in another book that they should be term limited, but that's a whole other issue. So, so the framers came up with an intricate system of governance, the purpose of which was to nurture the principles that are in the Declaration of Independence. And so when I wrote this book, I said, well, where do these principles come from? The founders weren't the ones who invented them. Where do they come from? Unalienable rights, divine rights. What's natural law? What's the laws of nature? Honestly, how many of you in public school or college were taught about the laws of nature? Raise your hand. Okay, maybe 1% of you. Do you understand that's the core foundational principle of our founding? So where did it come from? Our founders were enormously well-read men. They didn't watch TV. You know, they had, what did they do to keep busy? They read. And so among the people they read, Aristotle. Is Aristotle read in the 11th grade today? I seriously doubt it. Cicero. Cicero read in the 11th grade today? I seriously doubt it. And I can go on and on. So I went back and looked at who they relied on. And how do we know who they relied on? Because they told us who they relied on. And Aristotle talks about the difference between universal law, eternal truths, that sort of thing, and what he called practical law, government. Cicero talks about Aristotle talking about universal law. And he talks about it. And Cicero lost his life. He was killed because he didn't buy that the emperor was God. And he'd been a senator. He was a brilliant man. Most of these men had to run for their lives. John Locke had to escape England. And most of what John Locke wrote, the language that he used, appeared in the Declaration of Independence. These things are not taught. So today what we have are very emotional, passionate arguments on the left and with the national populists. And what I'm saying is, it's time to reteach what it means to be an American. And it's also time to teach what it means not to be. Now, we have a great story to tell. You're not going to see it on CNN. And you're not going to see it on MSNBC. First of all, the reporters are too stupid to know anything I'm talking about. But secondly, they're progressives, like the vast majority of reporters are, and quite frankly, the vast majority of politicians are. So I take people back to the philosophies that undergird our founding. And they're magnificent philosophies. These are magnificent men who stood up to tyranny, one form or another. And then on the other side, I try to explain what progressivism is, because people just don't know that, oh, he's a liberal. It's a very dark, bleak, dangerous ideology. The difference between conservatism, which is what I now call Americanism, the difference between Americanism and progressivism is Americanism is based on human experience. It's based on human experience, as Edmund Burke would say. One generation to the next, learning one from the next, what's right, what's wrong, as a practical matter. Progressivism is an ideology. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean, it's a doctrinaire ideology. Work or not is of no consequence. Compassionate or not is of no consequence. It's the ideology that matters. And you grab as much power as you can through the instrumentalities of government to impose your ideology. As a modern day example would be Obamacare. Everybody knows Obamacare is an absolute disaster. Absolute disaster. Nobody knows it more than the American people who have to suffer under it. And yet, for the progressive, they won't give an inch on Obamacare. It doesn't matter what the facts show. It doesn't matter what information you have. It just doesn't matter. They've managed to quasi-nationalize health care, and they're not going to give an inch. Whereas we sit back and we go through sort of a cerebral and practical review, and we say, well, this doesn't work because of this, and it doesn't matter to them. Same with education, same with national security, same with the border. And where does their ideology come from? It comes from very dangerous men, imported mostly from Germany. It comes from a man named Rousseau. He wasn't German, but I'll get to them. It comes Rousseau. Another one by the name of Hegel. And a third one by the name of Marx. They pretend to reject Marxism. And I'm not hawking it. You've already bought the book. You read about these three men in this book. And you will know who the founding fathers of the modern progressive movement are, as opposed to our founding fathers, and why I don't say we tear down their statues, but we don't celebrate their statues either. And so when you look at the two forces, as I say, there's tributaries, but when you look at the two main forces that go on in this country, you realize that you are embracing something that, in terms of the founding of a nation, has almost never occurred before. Our founders, and then later our framers of the Constitution, started a country on principles that a country had never been started on in human history, in all of human history. Aristotle's views were not embraced by Athens. Cicero's views weren't embraced by Rome. Locke's views were considered dangerous. Montesquieu was considered almost irrelevant. De Tocqueville's views in his two volumes, Democracy in America, were ignored for 50 years. These are Europeans. Burke, although admired by our founders, was not particularly important at that particular time. We're the ones who embraced the Enlightenment. We're the ones who embraced individualism. We're the ones who embraced the idea of ordered liberty. The other side embraces notions of autocracy, coercion, centralization, wrapped up in phrases about, the poor or the middle class, or however they do it. I don't even remember what your question was, but I just want to say one other thing. When you listen to Bernie Sanders, if you must, if you listen to Bernie Sanders, he goes on and on about free college, free health care, free this and free that. What he never talks about is individual liberty. because he doesn't believe in it. And when you read the book, and I talk about the progressives, the intellectuals of 120 years ago, Woodrow Wilson and Weil, people you may not have heard of before, and Dewey and Crowley. I only picked four very prominent ones, but there's more. You will know and you will understand that they have nothing but contempt for the founding of this country. They trash the Declaration by word. They trash the Constitution because they seek to import the notions of Rousseau and Hegel and Marx into this country. Take this phrase, living and breathing Constitution. That comes from Woodrow Wilson in the 1800s. Because Woodrow Wilson argued that the Constitution is a throwback to the pioneer days. The Constitution is a throwback to a time where it's mostly an agricultural society, and we're a much more complex, forward-looking society, and so forth. And we can't have our hands tied by all these ideas of separation of powers and states' rights and all the rest of it. We have to develop, train a group, a small army of experts to plan society. This is what they believed, and this is what they've done, except it's not so small. There's 2 million bureaucrats. And these people have got to determine, for the rest of us, the best way for us to live, because we are incapable of it. This rugged individualism stuff is destructive of society. This constitutional checks and balances means it's impossible for the federal government to answer modern issues. And this is what they do: the centralization of government, the destruction of individualism. In fact, Marx and Hegel and Rousseau all argue that the individual must surrender their individualism to the community, to the government, to the state, in order for this government and state, run by these trained experts who are all compassionate, all brilliant, all whatever they are, who will then determine the best plans for society, so it's fair, so it's equal, and that way you also destroy all these vestiges of feudalism and all the rest of it. And so when you hear Bernie Sanders, I'm just using him as a foil, could be any of the kooks on the left. When you hear Bernie Sanders go on about free education, free health care, free this and that, let me ask you a question. Even though he dresses it up as for the people, who runs it? The government. In every single case, the government runs it. Let me just end this part with this. Who are these experts? Let me ask you a question about your bureaucracy. And if there's anybody who works in the bureaucracy, I'm not attacking everybody in the bureaucracy. Just most everybody in the bureaucracy. Who runs the bureaucracy? Who are these people? How do they get their jobs? Well, some of them through the civil service. I'm talking about the federal government. Some of them through the civil service system. Some of them keep it through seniority. Some of them get it through affirmative action. Some of them get it through who they know. You can't fire anybody. Well, what exactly is the expertise? And when we talk about expertise, what do we mean by expertise? By experience? By education? Were they in the private sector? Were they ever in the private sector? By the college they went to? What is this training and what is this expertise that they have that 320 million American people don't have when it comes to their own lives, their own businesses, their own employment, and their own families? The answer is none.
Okay, Mark.
It's about 30 minutes a question.
Well, we got all night.
Any true or false?
This will be a little like your radio show. We're going to go from Marx and Hegel and Rousseau and Locke, and now a caller calls in, They just want to know what you think of Donald Trump, and is he doing a good job or a bad job. And I've heard you, Mark. I try to, going home every night, I catch roughly an hour of you, and I've heard you compliment him in certain respects on certain actions and denigrate him in others. And I just wonder, you want to make a general statement about our President of the United States?
Yes, I do. I apply our principles to whomever the politician is. And I've been pleasantly surprised by a number of the positions the President of the United States has taken. Now, I don't agree with everything, but so what? My biggest concern right now is that issues aside, there's something more fundamental going on right now. There is an effort, and I started this phrase, so I'll say it again, at a silent coup, and I really believe this. You have a President of the United States who is legitimately elected, whether people like him or not, whether they agree with everything he has done or not, whether they like the way he talks or not. Well, too damn bad. He's the President of the United States. He's not Ronald Reagan, but he's Donald Trump. Thank God he's not Hillary Clinton or Barack Obama. You have to be Helen Keller not to see and hear what's going on in this country. The effort to topple this president, the idea that we have a special counsel 4 or 5 months into the presidency, the idea they keep talking about Russian collusion and we're all waiting, can you show us something? I pointed out way back in March that the political, domestic surveillance that was taking place in this country by the prior administration against the people of this country, and I strongly believe it, and other things that took place, the sellout of this country with Iran, the undermining of the Strategic Defense Initiative that Ronald Reagan began in the face of the North Korean buildup, the arming of the Iranians with over $100 billion, which ensures that they will have ICBMs with nuclear warheads aimed at this country that your children and my children are going to have to take out of their hands. And so I say, so he tweets. Let's put this in some kind of balance, if you will. Now, I could sit here and say some of his tweets are bad. I could sit here and say, I wish he wouldn't do this, I wish he wouldn't do that. I wish the Democrats would stop trying to destroy his presidency and destroy this country. And that's exactly what they're doing. There are areas I disagree with the president on. So let's have a fair debate. You have to destroy the man? Let's have a fair debate about trade. Let's have a fair debate about infrastructure, another $1 trillion down the hole. We can talk about all that. But you got to rip his lungs out? So I step back and I see, from my perspective, that if they succeed in this, then from my perspective, the Republican form of government and the Constitution are weakened. And so none of these issues are enough for me to turn me on this president. I can disagree with him. I'm honest. I tell you where I'm coming from on the radio and on Levin TV. I tell you where my principles are. I tell you where I think he's wrong, where he's right. Great. I would do that with any president. But there's something going on now that is simply unacceptable, and I think we need to address it and we need to confront it.
One more question from me, and then I'd like to turn it to you in the audience and give you about 15 minutes of time with Mark on that. Can you talk with us, Mark, as you did on the radio last week, about Charlottesville? And I don't necessarily mean that particular incident, but this movement in the country, where lawfully some city councils are voting in the dead of night to remove Southern war hero type statues in other cities are being taken down, by citizens on their own volition. And I wonder where you come out on this issue of history versus memorializing through statues, and if you just comment on that recent situation.
I come down where one of the great modern commentators comes down, Charles Barkley. He said, I don't give those statues 1 second thought, and I never have. But I do give thought about education, about our people killing each other, about doing what's right for progress, for prosperity, for equality, and that sort of thing. And you look at the polls of the American people are basically saying the same thing. What is all this? Now, anybody ever been to Rome here? I've never been to Rome. You ever been to the Colosseum? You know what took place in the Colosseum? So many Christians were murdered in so many ways in the Colosseum, I couldn't even tell you how many or how many ways. But it stands. Why don't you knock it down? Knock it down. It's horrific. What does it stand for? These statues are part of our history. There are people who think they're great, and there are people who think these generals are outrageous, and let them debate. But I started a movement a couple of years ago, and I want to congratulate the backbenchers for finally catching up with it, which is to abandon the name Democrat Party. Because the Democrat Party, all those generals, every damn one of those generals was a Democrat. That Civil War, it was basically the Democrat Party versus the Republican Party. You look at segregation in this country, Plessy versus Ferguson and so forth, and who was undermining Reconstruction. It was the Democrat Party. The whole history of the Democrat Party has been whitewashed. It's been whitewashed by our schools, by colleges and universities, by the media, by not just Democrats, dopey Republicans too. It is they who, all the way up to the 1960s, stood for segregation and bigotry and racism. Those were Democrat governors who stood in those doors, in those elementary schools to prevent little black kids from going to school with little white kids. And it was Democrats who prevented older black kids going to college with older white kids. And in the first instance, it was a Republican president, you may have heard of him, by Dwight David Eisenhower, who sent the 82nd Airborne into Arkansas to address Mr. Orville Forbes. And he said, you just nationalized, he took over the National Guard, and Eisenhower didn't think it was good enough to take the National Guard back. He sent a combat division into a state and opened up that school. The first civil rights bill was the 1957 Civil Rights Bill, Eisenhower and the Republicans. The second civil rights bill was the 1960 Civil Rights Bill, Eisenhower and the Republicans. The 1964 Civil Rights Bill, proposed by Johnson, he had to rely on an overwhelming majority of Republicans to get it passed. Same with the 1965 Civil Rights Bill, the Voting Rights Act. And it was Democrat after Democrat after Democrat who fought it. J. William Fulbright, who was Bill Clinton's mentor, was a racist and a segregationist. And there's so many, you can name them. We have aircraft carriers named after some of these guys. You don't hear them saying change the name of aircraft carriers. So the Democrats put up these monuments, and now some Democrats want to take them down. Although I saw something rather hilarious the other day, where Nancy Pelosi said to, yeah, she's hilarious, where Nancy Pelosi said to Paul Ryan, I insist that you take down these Confederate statues. You're the speaker. And I said, who the hell was speaker 10 years ago? She was. How many Confederate statues did she take down? 0. My view, leave those statues alone, and if they're offensive, say they're offensive. And many of them are offensive to me, by the way. If they're offensive, duke it out not in the streets, duke it out on ideas. Teach your kids and your grandkids what that general did and who that general was. Because there's no drawing lines. Now we're talking about Washington and Jefferson, and then we're going to get to the Declaration and the Constitution and all the rest. Because this is the progressive movement. Remember what I said. Destroy all that had existed before and start all over again. I smell them, I know them, and I explain them right there. And one last thing. We Republicans don't need lectures from Democrats about civil rights or individual liberty or any damn thing of the sort. They are the ones who owe us and the nation an apology, not the other way around.
Now, before I go to the audience, Mark, I heard a interview of you a couple of weeks ago in relation to your book coming out, and the interviewer asked a question about, Mark, if you could have lived in another time other than now, when would it have been? When would you prefer? And I heard you say, well, boy, it would really have been something to have been around during the time of our founding fathers, as you so eloquently post. So I was on a trip to Washington, D.C. recently. I went to the National Archives, and I was able to go through a lot of material, including some famous portraits and paintings. And I found one I thought you might find just fascinating. Maybe if you could put it up for us, Mr. Producer. You might lift it over more, Mark. So Mark, I wanted to know what you have been hiding something from us.
Why didn't you put me in the chair?
Just FYI that he's taking the place of our Thomas Jefferson there, and I found that quite apropos. So, with that, what I'd like to do is open up to the audience to ask questions. If you would, raise your hand, but just wait until we put a microphone in your face as well, because you're on TV, and we want to make sure we can hear you. If I could, we'll start right over here to the left, Mark.
Thank you for coming, Mark. It's a joy and an honor to see you. I was just wondering on what occasion you might announce your candidacy for president.
Do you know what kind of audio they have on me? So I have no plans, but thank you.
Well,
have you
was
noticed
easy.
how many talk show hosts think they should be president of the United States? I'm not one of them, but thank you.
I remarked earlier about how we couldn't fit everyone in this room. We'd like to. We have a satellite room where we've got several hundred people, and I know we have a question from that room that will take us a second question. Mark, go ahead.
Hi, Mark. It's an honor. When I was in college, I had a professor who argued that Thomas Jefferson violated the Constitution with the Louisiana Purchase because he didn't get congressional approval for it and because he didn't have time to get it. So because of that, my professor argued that it was impractical to strictly adhere to the Constitution. So I've never been able to respond to that, and I was wondering if you could.
Honestly, I'm a little hard to hear. What was the question?
Oh,
The
boy.
Louisiana Purchase? So let me get this straight. The professor says because of the Louisiana Purchase, the Constitution is null and void? Is that what the professor said?
Congressional approval for it, and therefore he violated the Constitution by agreeing to it.
Maybe he did. So let me ask you this. Was he impeached?
No.
Were there articles of impeachment?
Nope.
Did Congress fund it?
Yes.
Okay.
There we go. Okay.
There you have it. Over here.
Thank you. How do we reverse the brainwashing that's going on in our educational system for the last 30 some odd years?
This might be the toughest question of them all. And I've been thinking about this a lot because, again, you'll see this fellow John Dewey, he made the case in the early 1900s that the progressives need to push the social agenda through this public school system, that it's not good enough to teach arithmetic and literature and history, but we need to teach, he said, what it all means. And of course, what it all means is America sucks, according to these people. So that's been the agenda for 100 years. Now, how do we address it? Well, people, in many cases, in their own lives need to address it. You can homeschool, you can send your kids to other types of schools, religious schools, private schools. Now, if you can't afford that, I think you need to take a much more active role with your school boards. I was a school board member, and these school boards are a joke, and they usually buckle under pressure. But the only people they hear from are teacher union members and other special interests that want, more tax dollars. On the college and university level, I think we have to figure out a way to break up these universities and colleges because they all hire from the same pools. The deans of the schools all know each other. It's a very incestuous relationship. And we are spending hundreds of billions of dollars every year in our tax dollars, apart from tuition by parents, subsidizing something we have absolutely no say in. They call it academic freedom. Let me ask you this. When a conservative can't speak up in class, or when a pro-Israel student stands up and is shouted down and threatened, or when any of our views cannot be voiced on a college campus or in a college classroom for the most part anymore, I think that we need to start to look at breaking up these systems, draining them of their resources, looking for alternatives, and really start to take it to them. But I also want to say, this is something I need to give a lot more thought to, because I think you're exactly right, and we got to figure out ways to address this, some of which are practical and some of which are long-term. I would remind you all it took us 100 years to get where we are here. So it may take us more than 3 months to get out of this. And the left, they're in it for long ball. They're in it forever. And one of the things that concerns me when I talk about Convention of States and Article 5, where we want to use a legitimate constitutional system to restore our constitutional system, and the left is all about breaking things down and burning things down, some of the most frustrating and major opposition I get are from conservatives. It'll never work. And we have 12 states, and we've gotten almost no publicity. And we need 34. And let me suggest if we got 20 or 22, then Washington would start to get very, very nervous about it. It's quintessential federalism. It's the 10th Amendment. It's in Article 5, where the framers of the Constitution, 2 days before the end of the Constitution, adopted a second method for amending the Constitution. When George Mason got up on the floor of the Pennsylvania Assembly House, which was where they were debating the Constitution as they debated the Declaration, and he said, what kind of an amendment system is it that empowers the federal Congress to decide how to amend the Constitution? And if they're oppressive, then only violence can change what's going on. And that's why they adopted Article 5. And I am proud to see Governor Abbott of Texas. I am proud to see a lot of these men stand up and women stand up. So there are things out there that people are talking about, a little bit more long ball, and that's what we have to focus on, in my opinion. Whether we pull ourselves out, I don't know. But I'm not prepared to roll up into a fetal position and turn my kids and grandkids over to a country that is unimaginable.
Right here.
With Steve Bannon's leaving the White House and going back to Breitbart, do you see any possibility of reshaping the media with CRTV, what you're doing, really becoming the media and taking over the narrative?
We're not going to take over the narrative. We can try and have a more prominent role in the narrative. But let's not fool ourselves. The networks, the three network, ABC, NBC, and ABC, even though their audiences have shrunk significantly, you know, a bad night on a news show there is 20, 22 million. You know, cable TV may get 3.5 million on a good night. So all this bicep, you know, showing and all the rest with websites and this site and that site, nobody's taking over anybody. But the more competition, the better. The more competition, the better. And also, you see technology has made a lot of changes. So we went from network to cable, cable to satellite, satellite to things like Netflix or a CRTV or whatever it is. To me, that's all good stuff. Does that mean that all the people who do this stuff are good? No, some of them are the worst human beings on the face of the earth. But that's the way it works. I'm all for the competition, all new technological platforms, and to press it as far as we can.
Up here in the balcony, Mark?
Don't jump.
Hey, Mark. Not only are the Democrats just trying to destroy our president, we have all those rhino Republicans that are doing their best to undermine our president. How do we as conservatives keep a positive attitude about the direction of our country unless our president can go forward with all of his, whatever he wants to do?
Well, you know
for
what?
us?
It would help if our president didn't back a rhino in Alabama. That would be a good start. Or keep putting his arm around Paul Ryan. That would be a good start. Look, I have tried to lead this fight to defeat Mitch McConnell for years and years and years. We finally dealt with Boehner. But they're like the pod people. It's one, and then the next one goes in, and then the next one goes in, and the next one goes in. Because they've built this insular type of situation. Well, let's take a look at the Senate leadership. Who's behind McConnell? I think it's Cornyn. Who's behind him? It's Blunt or Lamar Alexander. It doesn't matter. There they are. But to answer your question, I think the president has started in the last few weeks wisely focusing in on a Mitch McConnell. But you can't take on a Mitch McConnell and then back his candidate for Alabama, which is one of our most conservative states. When you have conservatives running in a primary, if he'd stayed out of it, we probably would have two conservatives duking it out for the general election there. So there needs to be a little bit more strategic thinking in this regard. As for the rhinos, these are progressives. They never wanted to get rid of Obamacare. They lied to us. It's the biggest lie in modern American history. Where's the money for the wall? They have no intention of paying for this wall. Maybe they'll put a little here or a little there, do something like that, but nothing significant. They always tell us what they can't do. I have a question. Why is it that when Schumer's in the minority, he runs the Senate, and when he's in the majority, he runs the Senate? Why is it when we're in the majority, we've got the filibuster rule, we got this committee, we got this one over here, and this is standing over there? For them, they just roll through, baby, and they get their agenda through. I say let's try that for a couple of years and see how they like it.
Mark, we have time for one last question. We'll go right over here.
Hi, Mark. Thanks for being here. My husband and I are big fans. My question is this. For those of us that follow your program and really know what's going on, it's easy to get depressed over it and to get really down. So I want to know what you
such
think.
Great ratings. All the depressed people are listening. No, go ahead.
I want to know if you see hope, and if you can give us some examples of the things that you see that give you hope.
You know, there's really two aspects to our lives, isn't there? It's our personal life, our family, and so forth, where I see hope every single day. Something positive, something worth living for, something worth doing something for. Then there's government. Government, government, and more government. You know, it's difficult. The Republicans control the House, the Republicans control the Senate, the Republicans control the White House, and we keep moving backwards. So this is why I encourage people to get involved in the Convention of States, not as a shiny object, but as a real movement. This is why I also tell people there are tens of millions of us who share our values and our beliefs. In fact, I would say a majority of American people. But we can operate somewhat outside of government. We can teach our kids. You don't have to homeschool them, but you do see them at breakfast. You do put them to bed at night. Well, maximize those opportunities and turn them into a little kid in the classroom who raises questions and back them up against the principal and so forth and so on if they're respectful. There's a lot of things that we can do in our lives that will have an effect on the culture. Even look at the movies today. The movies are not going anywhere because people are sick and tired of crap movies. And that's a good thing. So to answer your question, if you define your daily life through Washington, D.C., you will be in a perpetual state of depression. I don't say ignore it, because they are devouring the civil society. They are devouring the culture, and we fight it. But your life has to be multifaceted. Look, I'm no psychologist. I'm just talking about the way I live my life. So that's the best answer I can give you.
Mark, as we close and head to dinner, we always leave our very special guests with a very special present, and in this case, I don't know how we could do better than to give you a really nice framed copy of you with the framers of the Constitution.
That's beautiful. But you know what, John? If there was a statue of me, I think they'd be pulling it down about now.
We'll see you all at dinner. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I have two announcements. One of them is very important to one person in this room. The other one is important